Welcome to Silent Screams, where the ordinary becomes extraordinary in the most terrifying ways. Tonight, we dive into a story that will make you question the safety of your own home. This isn't just about creaks in the floorboards or strange drafts. What if your house was alive? Let's step inside, together, and see what lies within the walls. It started with small things, as it always does. Andrew had lived in his house for almost 5 years, a modest, single-story home on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was his, and he took pride in keeping it tidy. But lately, he'd begun to notice changes. At first, it was just noises, the kind you could explain away. The groaning of old wood, the occasional pop of the heating system. But soon, the sounds became harder to ignore. One night, as he lay in bed, Andrew heard a faint tapping. It wasn't rhythmic, like the sound of a tree branch against a window. It was erratic, like someone, or something, was trying to communicate. He sat up, his heart pounding, and strained to listen. The tapping stopped. He let out a shaky breath, convinced it was just his imagination, and lay back down. But the next morning, he noticed something strange. The large mirror in the hallway had a single crack running through it, jagged and fresh. He frowned, running his fingers over it. It hadn't been there the day before, and nothing could have hit it. The mirror was too high for anyone to accidentally bump. Shaking his head, Andrew wrote it off as a coincidence and went about his day. The following week, the incidents became harder to dismiss. Doors would creak open on their own, no matter how tightly he'd closed them. The lights in the kitchen would flicker every time he walked into the room, and the air always seemed colder there, even though the thermostat read a steady 70 degrees. One evening, as he was washing dishes, he felt a sharp chill run down his spine. He turned and saw the kitchen door slowly swinging shut. It moved with an eerie, deliberate slowness, as though pushed by an invisible hand. Andrew froze, the dishwater dripping from his hands onto the floor. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. There was no answer, just the faint creak of the door as it came to a stop. For the first time, he felt a gnawing sense of unease in his own home, a place that had always been his sanctuary. A few nights later, Andrew woke to the sound of whispers. He sat bolt upright in bed, his heart racing. The whispers were faint, coming from somewhere deep within the house. He couldn't make out any words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Gathering his courage, he grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the hallway as he crept toward the sound. The whispers led him to the living room. The air was thick and cold, and Andrew could feel the weight of something watching him, though he couldn't see anything. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the walls. They seemed to move, almost imperceptibly, as though they were breathing. He stepped closer, his breath visible in the icy air. As he reached out to touch the wall, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural groan that reverberated through the house. Andrew stumbled back, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. The beam of light swung wildly, catching something in the corner of the room. For a split second, he saw it, a shadowy figure, tall and gaunt, its face featureless yet somehow filled with malice. And then it was gone. From that night on, the house grew more restless. Andrew would wake to find furniture rearranged, objects he hadn't touched moved to different rooms. One morning, he discovered claw marks on the inside of his bedroom door, deep gouges that hadn't been there the night before. He spent hours pacing the house, searching for signs of animals, intruders, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. The worst was the basement. Andrew had always avoided it. The low ceiling and dim lighting made it feel claustrophobic. But now, the basement seemed to call to him. The door, which he always kept shut, would be open every morning, a faint red glow emanating from the stairs. The first time he saw it, he slammed the door shut, his hands shaking. But the glow persisted, bleeding through the cracks and casting eerie patterns on the floor. One night, unable to bear the mystery any longer, Andrew decided to go down. He armed himself with a heavy flashlight and a kitchen knife, though he felt foolish carrying it. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended, the red glow growing brighter with each step. When he reached the bottom, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The walls of the basement were covered in markings, symbols etched into the stone. They pulsed faintly, as though alive. In the center of the room was a large, circular stain, dark and wet, spreading outward like a blooming flower. Andrew's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as he stepped closer to the stain. And then he heard it, a voice, low and raspy, whispering his name. Andrew. He whipped around, the knife trembling in his hand, but the basement was empty. The voice came again, louder this time, reverberating through the room. Andrew, why did you leave me? It was a voice he recognized, one that made his blood run cold. It was his mother's, but she had been dead for years. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their light pulsing in time with his racing heart. The voice grew louder, more insistent, echoing in his ears. Come home, Andrew. Come back. He dropped the knife, his hands clamped over his ears as the words drilled into his skull. The room felt alive, the walls closing in, the floor trembling beneath him. Somehow, he found the strength to run. He stumbled up the stairs, the red glow chasing him as he slammed the basement door shut. The house groaned in protest, the sound of its anger reverberating through every room. He didn't stop to grab anything. He bolted out the front door, into the cold night air, and didn't look back. Andrew never returned to the house. He left it behind, along with everything he owned. But sometimes, late at night, when he's alone, he still hears it, the whispers, faint and pleading, calling his name from somewhere far away. Andrew didn't speak about the house for weeks. He stayed with a friend in the city, dodging questions about why he had left so suddenly or why he refused to retrieve his belongings. The nightmares started soon after he left. In his dreams, the house was alive, pulsating like a beating heart. He'd find himself back inside, standing in the basement, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter and brighter until they consumed him. The voice, his mother's voice, would call to him, its tone shifting between sorrow and rage, pleading for him to return. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that it was just the trauma of living in such an old, creaky house. But the house didn't seem ready to let him go. It began with the small things, a faint creaking sound that he'd hear in the middle of the night, as though footsteps were moving through his friend's apartment. Then, objects started shifting positions. He'd leave his wallet on the counter, only to find it on the coffee table. A coffee cup he'd washed and placed in the cabinet would reappear, dirty, in the sink. One morning, as he was brushing his teeth, Andrew noticed something in the mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw the hallway of the old house behind him, its walls breathing, its shadows stretching toward him. He spun around, heart racing, but he was still in his friend's bathroom. The mirror, however, now bore a faint smudge, almost like a handprint, pressed against the glass from the inside. He didn't tell his friend about it, too afraid of sounding insane, but the unease followed him everywhere. A week later, the dreams took a darker turn. Andrew woke in the middle of the night to find himself standing in the middle of his friend's living room. He didn't remember getting out of bed, didn't remember walking there. The room was silent, the city outside unusually quiet. He noticed something on the floor, a trail of dark, wet footprints leading to the door. His heart sank when he realized the footprints started from where he had been standing. He locked the door and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, too afraid to move. When his friend woke up the next morning, Andrew made up a story about feeling sick and needing some time to himself. He packed a small bag and checked into a motel on the edge of town, desperate to put some distance between himself and whatever was happening. But the motel wasn't any better. That night, as he lay on the thin, scratchy bed, Andrew heard something scratching at the window. He tried to convince himself it was a branch swaying in the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Slowly, he pulled back the curtain, his breath catching in his throat. Outside the window, in the faint glow of the parking lot light, he saw it, a shadowy figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing motionless. Its head was tilted, just like the figure he had seen in the corner of his living room weeks before. Andrew stumbled back, his heart pounding. The scratching stopped, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, its outline blurring and shifting as though it wasn't entirely solid. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking, and called the front desk. The clerk answered groggily, annoyed by the late-night disturbance, but when Andrew tried to explain, the line went dead. The lights in the room flickered, and the temperature dropped sharply. Andrew's breath fogged in the cold air as he backed into the corner, clutching his phone like a lifeline. The figure was inside the room now. It didn't walk, it glided, its movements slow and deliberate. The shadows around it seemed to twist and warp, bending toward it like iron to a magnet. Andrew couldn't scream, couldn't move, as it stopped just a few feet away. It didn't have a face, not exactly, but its head shifted and stretched, forming vague impressions of features that flickered like static on a screen. And then it spoke, not aloud, but directly into his mind. "You left," it said, its voice overlapping and disjointed, a cacophony of whispers. "You weren't supposed to leave." Andrew bolted from the room, not caring that he was barefoot and in his pajamas. He ran into the night, the cold pavement biting at his feet, and didn't stop until he reached the highway. A trucker eventually picked him up, giving him a strange look when Andrew couldn't explain what he was running from. He only managed to stammer out a request to be dropped off at the next town. For weeks, Andrew kept moving, bouncing from motel to motel, city to city, but no matter where he went, the house followed. Sometimes it was the dreams, pulling him back to the basement with its pulsing cymbals and the voice of his mother. Other times, it was more tangible, the flicker of lights in a rented room, the faint sound of whispers in the dead of night, or the feeling of being watched, even in crowded places. The house wasn't just alive, it was aware, and it wanted him back. Desperate for answers, Andrew finally turned to the internet. He posted his story on a forum, hoping someone might have experienced something similar or could offer advice. The responses were mixed, some mocked him, others shared their own chilling tales, but one reply stood out. It came from a user with no profile picture and a cryptic username: "Leave the house alone, or it will never leave you." The user claimed they had encountered a similar phenomenon years ago, in a different house, in a different state. They described the same breathing walls, the same symbols, the same whispers. The only way they had escaped was by returning to the house and confronting it. Andrew's blood ran cold as he read the final line of the message: *, the house doesn't want to haunt you. It wants to become you, *. Andrew knew he couldn't keep running. The house wouldn't let him. Wherever he went, it would find him, dragging its shadows and whispers along with it. He had to go back, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't have a choice. Whatever the house wanted, it wasn't going to stop until it got it. As Andrew stood on the outskirts of his old neighborhood, staring at the distant outline of the house against the night sky, he felt the weight of its presence pressing down on him. The house was waiting, and he could almost hear it breathing, each exhale drawing him closer, each inhale pulling him back into its suffocating embrace. And as the wind carried a faint, familiar whisper to his ears, he stepped forward, knowing there was no turning back.